At our 10th anniversary gala, surrounded by 500 of the city's most influential people, my husband looked into my eyes and told me I was nothing more than decorative furniture in his life. I walked out of that ballroom with nothing but my dignity and a burning determination. Within 3 years, I built a technology empire worth $200 million, and the man who humiliated me came begging for a place in the company he said I could never create. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Crystal Pavilion in downtown Seattle was designed to make its occupants feel like they were floating above the city, suspended in a glass sanctuary where wealth and influence gathered to celebrate itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond, while crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across polished marble floors that reflected the glittering dresses and designer suits of people who measured their worth in private jets and vacation properties. This was where Seattle's technology elite came to see and be seen, where venture capitalists made connections that would fund the next billion-dollar startup, where entrepreneurs pitched ideas over champagne that cost more per bottle than most families spent on groceries in a month. I stood in the center of that magnificent space wearing a custom emerald silk gown that my husband had insisted I purchase from a boutique in Paris during our last trip to Europe. The dress cost $30,000 and fit perfectly because I had flown back to France twice for additional fittings, spending more money on alterations than I used to earn in 6 months when I was building websites from my studio apartment in Capitol Hill. My jewelry was borrowed from a private collection, insured for $500,000 for the single evening. I would wear the diamond and emerald pieces that complemented my gown. My hair had been styled by a professional who arrived at our Medina waterfront estate at noon to spend 4 hours creating an elaborate updo that would photograph well from every angle. Everything about my appearance that evening had been carefully orchestrated by my husband Marcus Thornton and his executive assistant, who together had planned every detail of our 10th anniversary celebration with the precision of a military campaign. The guest list included 500 carefully selected individuals representing the most powerful people in Seattle's technology sector, the venture capital community that funded innovation, the political establishment that regulated it, and the media outlets that covered it all. Marcus had insisted on the Crystal Pavilion despite my preference for something more intimate, something that felt more like a celebration of our marriage, rather than a corporate networking event disguised as personal milestone. The evening had proceeded exactly according to the schedule. His assistant had developed and distributed to all relevant parties. Cocktails began at 7 with premium spirits and locally sourced appetizers prepared by a celebrity chef who had flown in from San Francisco specifically for this event. At 8, guests moved into the main ballroom where tables had been arranged with centerpieces featuring rare orchids imported from Thailand, their exotic beauty meant to signal sophistication and global reach. Dinner was served at 8:30. A 5-course tasting menu paired with wines selected by a sommelier whose services cost more than most people earned in a week. Throughout dinner, I made conversation with people seated at our table, technology executives and their spouses who asked polite questions about my work, while clearly considering me primarily as Marcus Thornton's wife, rather than as an individual with my own professional identity. I had grown accustomed to this dynamic over the past 5 years as Marcus's company had exploded from a promising startup into a dominant force in cloud infrastructure services. The more successful he became, the more I seemed to disappear into the role of supportive spouse, the woman who stood beside him in photographs and made small talk at events while the real business happened in conversations I was not part of. Between the 4th and 5th courses, while guests were enjoying a palate cleanser of champagne sorbet with fresh berries, Marcus stood and tapped his crystal wine glass with a silver fork. The clear ringing sound cut through the ambient conversation and laughter, drawing attention toward our table at the center of the ballroom. A spotlight operator had been positioned for this moment, and suddenly a beam of light illuminated Marcus while the rest of the room fell into relative shadow. He looked magnificent in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, his dark hair styled perfectly, his smile confident and commanding in the way that had helped him raise $300 million in venture capital funding over the past 7 years. I assumed he was going to make a toast thanking everyone for attending our anniversary celebration, perhaps tell some charming story about our early years together, when we were struggling graduate students sharing a tiny apartment and dreaming about the future we would build together. I smiled up at him from my seat, my expression probably reflecting the genuine affection I still felt despite the growing distance I had noticed between us over the past several years. Whatever challenges existed in our marriage, I believed we could address them once this busy period of company growth stabilized and Marcus had more time to focus on our relationship rather than constantly managing investors, employees, and competitors. Marcus began speaking in the clear, confident voice he used for keynote presentations at technology conferences and investor meetings. He thanked everyone for attending this celebration of our 10th anniversary, acknowledged the effort required to gather so many busy people in one place on a Thursday evening, and made a joke about how long his assistant had worked on coordinating schedules and managing the endless details that made an event like this possible. People laughed appreciatively, enjoying the insider acknowledgement of how complex their lives were and how valuable their time was. Then his tone shifted in a way I did not immediately understand, becoming more serious and contemplative. He began talking about success and what it actually required, about the difficult choices people must make when building something significant, about the necessity of being honest with yourself and others about what truly matters. I listened with growing confusion, uncertain where this reflection was leading or why he had chosen our anniversary celebration as the venue for philosophical musings about success and sacrifice. Marcus looked directly at me for the first time since beginning his speech, and I saw something in his expression that sent a chill through my body despite the warmth of the crowded ballroom. His eyes were cold in a way I had never seen before, calculating rather than affectionate, assessing me like I was a quarterly financial report rather than his wife of 10 years. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes and contained no warmth or genuine emotion. What he said next would replay in my mind thousands of times over the following months, each word etched into my memory with perfect clarity despite the shock that made the rest of the evening feel surreal and disconnected. His voice remained steady and clear, projecting to every corner of the ballroom through the excellent sound system that had been installed specifically for this event. Every guest could hear him perfectly, and the room had fallen completely silent in that expectant way audiences do when they sense something significant is about to happen. The truth is that Victoria has been exactly what I needed for the past 10 years. A beautiful, supportive presence who made my life comfortable and my public image complete. But as I have evolved and my company has grown, I have realized that I need a true partner who can contribute meaningfully to my success, rather than simply existing alongside it. Victoria is wonderful at hosting events and looking perfect in photographs, but those skills are essentially decorative, and I have reached a point where decoration is not enough. The words hung in the air like poison gas, visible and toxic and impossible to take back. My brain struggled to process what my ears had clearly heard, running through the sentences again trying to find some interpretation where those words meant something other than what they obviously meant. Decorative. Not enough. Existing alongside rather than contributing. He had just told 500 of the most influential people in Seattle's technology community that I was essentially ornamental furniture in his life, attractive but functionally useless beyond superficial appearance. The silence that followed his statement was suffocating and complete. No one moved or spoke or even seemed to breathe. 500 people sat frozen in their seats, wine glasses suspended halfway to mouths, forks held motionless above plates of untouched dessert, all eyes moving between Marcus standing in the spotlight and me sitting in shock at the table below him. I could feel their stares like physical weight pressing down on me from every direction, some faces showing genuine shock and sympathy, others showing barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing someone else's spectacular humiliation, still others showing the careful neutrality of people calculating how this development might affect their own business relationships with Marcus Thornton. I looked around the ballroom searching for something to anchor myself to, some familiar face that might offer support or at least acknowledgement that this was actually happening and I was not experiencing some kind of stress-induced hallucination. I found my college roommate Jennifer sitting 3 tables away, her hand covering her mouth in obvious shock, her eyes wide with disbelief and sympathy. I found Marcus's business partner David looking down at his plate with an expression that could have been embarrassment or resignation, suggesting he might have known this was coming and said nothing to warn me. I found Marcus's mother sitting at the family table looking pale and stricken, clearly as surprised as I was by her son's public cruelty. Marcus continued speaking as though he had just shared a mildly interesting business insight rather than destroyed his wife in front of everyone we knew. He talked about how he was announcing tonight the formation of a new strategic partnership with Alexis Chan, the chief operating officer of his company, someone who truly understood his vision and could contribute at the level he required for the next phase of growth. He thanked me for the past 10 years and wished me well in finding whatever path would make me happy, speaking about our marriage like it was a business relationship being dissolved amicably, rather than a life partnership being exploded without warning or discussion. Alexis Chun stood from where she had been sitting at a nearby table and walked to join Marcus in the spotlight. She was beautiful in a severe way, wearing a black gown that looked expensive and architectural, her dark hair cut in a sharp geometric style that framed her face perfectly. She smiled at Marcus with obvious affection and familiarity, and when he put his arm around her shoulders, the gesture looked natural and practiced rather than awkward or new. They looked like a matched set, two ambitious, powerful people who belonged together in a way that Marcus's body language suggested he and I never had. The implication was immediately clear to everyone in the ballroom. This was not simply a business partnership announcement. This was Marcus Thornton publicly ending his marriage and beginning a new relationship with his chief operating officer, all conducted as a single coordinated announcement at our 10th anniversary celebration. He had planned this moment with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to product launches and investor presentations, turning what should have been a private conversation into a public spectacle that would be discussed and dissected by Seattle's technology community for months or possibly years. I sat completely still for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds, my mind blank with shock while my body remained frozen in my chair. Then something shifted inside me, some survival instinct or core of pride that refused to let me remain sitting there like a victim waiting for rescue or collapse. I stood slowly and deliberately, my emerald silk gown catching the light as I rose to my full height in the 4-inch heels I had worn despite knowing my feet would ache by the end of the evening. I looked directly at Marcus for a long moment, meeting his eyes with an expression I hoped conveyed nothing but calm assessment. I wanted him to see that I was not crying or begging, or causing a scene that would give him ammunition to use later when he told people about how badly I had handled the end of our marriage. I wanted him to see dignity and composure rather than the devastation I felt underneath my carefully controlled exterior. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then I turned to address the 500 guests who were still watching in stunned silence, waiting to see how I would respond to this unprecedented public humiliation. My voice when I spoke was surprisingly steady, clear and calm despite the shock that was making my hands tremble slightly. I could feel adrenaline coursing through my body, sharpening my focus while simultaneously making everything feel slightly surreal and disconnected. I appreciate Marcus's honesty this evening, even if his timing and venue are questionable. I wish him and Alexis every success in their partnership, both business and personal. For those of you who have wondered what I actually do beyond appearing decorative at events like this, I invite you to watch what I build next. It will be far more interesting than anything you have seen from me so far. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, some part of my personality that had been dormant or suppressed during the years of my marriage to Marcus but suddenly rose to the surface when I needed it most. I had no idea what I would build or how I would build it, but in that moment standing in front of 500 witnesses to my humiliation, I made a commitment that would determine the entire trajectory of my next chapter. I walked toward the ballroom exit with my head held high and my posture perfect, years of deportment lessons from my mother finally proving useful in maintaining dignity during catastrophe. My heels clicked against the marble floor in a steady rhythm that helped me focus on simply moving forward, rather than thinking about what had just happened, or what it meant for my future. The crowd parted automatically as I approached, people leaning back in their seats or standing to give me room to pass, their faces showing various combinations of sympathy, shock, curiosity, and discomfort. Jennifer caught up with me in the corridor outside the ballroom, her own heels clicking rapidly as she ran to reach me before I disappeared into the elevator or out of the building entirely. She grabbed my arm with enough force to stop my forward momentum, turning me to face her with tears streaming down her face even though I had not yet cried myself. Her distress on my behalf was touching, and would have made me cry if I had allowed myself to feel anything in that moment. But I could not afford to break down when I was still in a building full of people who would witness and discuss every aspect of my reaction. Victoria, what just happened? Did you know he was going to do that? Where are you going? You cannot just leave without talking to someone. Jennifer's questions came in rapid succession, her voice edged with genuine concern and confusion. She had known Marcus and me since graduate school, had been a bridesmaid at our wedding, had celebrated every milestone in our marriage and career progression. This public destruction of what she had believed was a successful partnership shocked her almost as much as it shocked me. I looked at my oldest friend and tried to find words to explain what I was feeling or thinking, but nothing came. I had no explanation for what had just occurred. No framework for understanding how the man I had been married to for 10 years could stand in front of 500 people and reduce me to decorative furniture before announcing his new relationship with the woman he worked with every day. The betrayal was so complete and so public that I could not yet fully process its dimensions or implications. I need to leave, Jennifer. I need to be alone and think about what happens next. I will call you tomorrow or the next day. But right now I need to get out of this building before I completely fall apart in front of everyone who just watched me get humiliated by my own husband at our anniversary party. My voice cracked slightly on the last few words, the first sign that my carefully maintained composure was beginning to fracture under the weight of what I was experiencing. Jennifer hugged me tightly, not caring that she was crushing the expensive fabric of both our gowns, or that her tears were leaving marks on my shoulder. She whispered that she loved me and that Marcus was a bastard, and that I deserved so much better than what he had done to me. Then she let me go, understanding that I needed space more than I needed company, that some experiences must be processed alone before they can be shared even with people who care deeply about your well-being. I took the elevator down to the parking garage where my car was waiting, a Tesla Model S that Marcus had given me 2 years ago as an anniversary present. The irony of leaving my husband in a car he had purchased was not lost on me, but I had no other transportation readily available, and was not going to call for a ride service and risk having a stranger witness whatever emotional collapse was coming once I was finally alone. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the car, staring at the concrete wall of the parking garage while my mind tried to process what had just occurred. The drive from downtown Seattle to our waterfront estate in Medina normally took 20 minutes on a Thursday evening with light traffic, but I have no memory of the actual journey that night. I drove on autopilot while my mind replayed Marcus's words and the looks on people's faces and the way Alexis Chan had stood beside him like she belonged there, like she was already his partner in every sense and I was simply the inconvenient previous version being erased from his story. When I pulled into our circular driveway and saw the house we had purchased 3 years ago as a symbol of Marcus's success, I felt nothing but emptiness. The house was dark and silent when I entered through the front door, my heels echoing on the imported Italian marble floors of the entrance hall. I walked through rooms we had furnished together with pieces selected by an interior designer who charged thousands of dollars to create the perfect aesthetic for a successful technology executive and his wife. Everything in this house was beautiful and expensive, and felt completely disconnected from anything I actually cared about or valued. I had become the human equivalent of this professionally decorated space, carefully selected to present the right image, but lacking any authentic connection to the person who supposedly owned it. I sat at the kitchen island, the same place where Marcus and I had eaten breakfast together just that morning before he left for his office, and I spent the day preparing for the evening celebration. He had kissed my forehead and told me he was looking forward to the party, that it would be a night to remember, that he appreciated everything I had done to make our life together so comfortable and beautiful. Had he already been planning what he would say that evening? Had he kissed me goodbye knowing it was the last time he would pretend affection? Had every word and gesture of our morning routine been performance while he mentally rehearsed the speech that would end our marriage in the most public and humiliating way possible? I sat in darkness as midnight came and went, as the house remained silent and empty, as Marcus did not return or call or send any message. I thought about our entire relationship through this new and terrible lens of understanding, seeing patterns I had missed or explained away during the years of our marriage. The gradual distancing that I had attributed to the pressures of building a company, the increasing time he spent at the office with Alexis and other members of his executive team, the way he had systematically discouraged me from being involved in his business beyond attending social events as his spouse, the subtle and sometimes not so subtle messages that my own work was less important than supporting his career. I had met Marcus Thornton 12 years ago in a graduate program for computer science at the University of Washington, both of us studying artificial intelligence and machine learning in a department that was just beginning to understand how transformative those technologies would become. I had been a promising student with excellent grades and several published papers on neural network architectures. Marcus had been charismatic and ambitious, already talking about starting a company rather than pursuing academic research or taking a corporate job after graduation. We had been assigned to work on a project together, and the intellectual connection quickly became romantic. In those early years, Marcus treated me like an equal partner, someone whose technical knowledge matched his own, and whose ideas contributed to our shared vision of what we might build together. We spent countless hours in coffee shops sketching out business plans and technical architectures, dreaming about the company we would found together, and the impact we would have on cloud computing infrastructure. When Marcus officially incorporated his company during our second year of graduate school, my name was on the founding documents alongside his. We were partners in every sense, building something together that would belong to both of us equally. But something shifted after we got married, subtle at first but increasingly obvious as time passed. Marcus began making decisions about the company without consulting me, explaining that he needed to move quickly and could not always wait for lengthy discussions about strategy or hiring or product direction. He brought in outside executives with specific expertise, people like Alexis Chun who had worked at major technology companies and understood how to scale operations and manage complex organizations. He raised venture capital funding that diluted my equity stake to near insignificance, while maintaining his own controlling position through carefully structured investment terms. When I objected or questioned why I was being gradually excluded from meaningful participation in a company I had helped found, Marcus told me I was being oversensitive or failing to understand how businesses actually scaled beyond the initial founding phase. He suggested that my skills were better suited to the technical work I did as a consultant building websites and applications for small businesses, rather than the high-stakes enterprise software sales and complex organizational management required to grow his company. He praised my work as valuable and important while simultaneously making clear it was less valuable and less important than what he was doing. Over time, I had accepted his characterization of our respective roles, convincing myself that supporting his success was the best way I could contribute to our shared future. I told myself that the equity I still held in his company, though significantly diluted, would eventually be worth enough to provide financial security regardless of whether I was involved in day-to-day operations. I focused on my consulting practice, building websites and applications for small businesses and nonprofit organizations, work that was satisfying but never particularly lucrative or high-profile. I became the supportive spouse who attended events and made appropriate conversation, and looked good in photographs beside the successful entrepreneur. Now, sitting alone in our kitchen at 2 a.m, I understood that I had allowed myself to become exactly what Marcus accused me of being that evening. Not because I was inherently decorative or incapable of substantive contribution, but because I had systematically accepted limitations and diminished expectations until they became self-fulfilling prophecies. I had stopped fighting for equal partnership and had accepted the role of beautiful supportive wife because fighting seemed exhausting and Marcus always had persuasive explanations for why things needed to be the way he said they did. But I also recognized something else in that dark kitchen as Friday morning began without my husband returning home or making any contact. Marcus had not actually destroyed me that evening at the Crystal Pavilion despite how completely he had tried. He had humiliated me and betrayed me and ended our marriage in the most public and cruel way imaginable. But he had not taken away my technical skills or my intelligence or my capacity to build something meaningful. He had not erased the knowledge I had gained through years of education and professional work. He had not eliminated my ability to make decisions and take action and create value. What Marcus had done, perhaps inadvertently, was free me from the comfortable trap our marriage had become. He had made it impossible for me to continue telling myself that supporting his success was enough, that being decorative was acceptable if it came with financial security and social status. He had forced me to either accept his characterization of me as essentially ornamental or prove him wrong by building something significant enough that no one would ever mistake me for decoration again. By the time dawn began lighting the sky over Lake Washington, turning the water pink and gold through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our kitchen, I had made a decision that would determine my entire future. I was not going to simply divorce Marcus and take whatever settlement I could negotiate and quietly disappear into a smaller life, where no one would remember I had once been married to someone important. I was going to build something so significant and so undeniable that Marcus Thornton would eventually realize that the decorative furniture he had discarded at our 10th anniversary gala was actually the most valuable thing he ever possessed. I had no detailed plan yet, no clear vision of exactly what I would build or how I would build it, but I had skills and knowledge and connections, and most importantly, I had fury that demanded to be channeled into something productive rather than destructive. Marcus thought he had won by publicly replacing me with someone he considered more valuable. He was about to discover that the competition he should have feared most was the one he had just created by underestimating the woman who had stood beside him for 10 years learning everything about how successful technology companies were actually built. I had not always been the woman who stood frozen in a ballroom, while her husband announced to 500 people that she was decorative furniture. There was a version of me that existed before Marcus Thornton, before the gradual erosion of confidence and ambition, before I learned to make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's expanding ego. Understanding how I arrived at that devastating moment requires going back to the beginning, to the person I was when I first walked into Professor Catherine Reed's artificial intelligence seminar at the University of Washington and discovered both my passion for machine learning and the man who would eventually use that passion against me. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, the daughter of 2 public school teachers who believed education was the most reliable path to a better life. My father taught high school mathematics and spent his evenings tutoring students who struggled with concepts that came easily to me. My mother taught elementary school and had endless patience for children who needed extra support learning to read or understand basic arithmetic. Neither of them earned significant money or achieved what most people would consider remarkable success, but they were respected in their community and genuinely loved their work. They raised me to believe that finding meaningful work you excelled at was more important than chasing wealth or status. I discovered computers when I was 12 years old through a summer program at the local library that taught basic programming to middle school students. The instructor was a retired software engineer who volunteered his time teaching kids how to write simple games in a programming language called Python. I was immediately captivated by the logic and precision of code, the way you could give computers explicit instructions and they would execute those instructions exactly as written. There was something deeply satisfying about the clarity of programming. After spending years in educational environments where so much communication was ambiguous or emotional, or dependent on interpretation. By the time I reached high school, I was taking advanced mathematics courses and teaching myself programming languages through online tutorials and books I checked out from the library. I built my first website when I was 15, a simple portfolio showcasing projects I had completed and offering to build websites for local businesses at rates so low they were essentially volunteer work. I did not care about money at that point. I cared about learning and building and proving to myself that I could create functional software that solved real problems for real people. My parents encouraged my interests without fully understanding them. Neither of them had technical backgrounds beyond basic computer literacy, but they recognized passion and aptitude when they saw it. They scraped together money to buy me a decent laptop when I was 16. Sacrificing their own vacation plans so I would have reliable hardware for my projects. They drove me to Seattle multiple times during my junior and senior years of high school, so I could attend technology meetups and hackathons where I met other people who spoke the language of code and understood why building elegant solutions to complex problems was intellectually satisfying. I received a full scholarship to the University of Washington based on my academic performance, and a portfolio of programming projects that demonstrated both technical skill and creative problem-solving. Moving to Seattle at 18 felt like stepping into a completely different world from the one I had known in Spokane. The university was enormous and diverse, full of students from wealthy families who had attended private schools and traveled internationally, and possessed cultural knowledge I had never been exposed to. I felt out of place initially, aware that my clothes came from discount stores and my technological education had been self-directed rather than provided by expensive preparatory programs. But once I started taking computer science courses, the playing field leveled in ways that mattered to me. Code did not care whether you had grown up wealthy or poor, whether you had attended elite schools or taught yourself from library books. Code cared whether you understood logic and algorithms and data structures, whether you could break complex problems into manageable components and build solutions that actually worked. In that environment, I excelled immediately. My professors noticed my talent and encouraged me to pursue graduate study and research, rather than simply taking a corporate software engineering job after graduation. I completed my undergraduate degree in 3 years instead of 4 by taking maximum course loads and attending summer sessions. I published my first academic paper as an undergraduate researcher working with Professor Catherine Reed on neural network optimization techniques. The paper was accepted to a competitive conference, and presenting my research to an audience of established academics and industry professionals gave me a taste of what intellectual contribution felt like beyond simply completing assignments for grades. I was hooked on the idea of pushing boundaries and discovering new approaches, rather than simply implementing existing solutions. When I entered the graduate program in computer science with a focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning, I was 21 years old and convinced I was going to become an academic researcher who would make meaningful contributions to the field. I imagined myself as a professor eventually, someone like Catherine Reed who mentored brilliant students and published groundbreaking papers, and was respected for her intellectual contributions rather than her ability to generate corporate profits. I had no particular interest in startups or entrepreneurship at that point. I found the culture around technology entrepreneurship somewhat distasteful, too focused on disruption for its own sake and generating massive wealth, rather than genuinely solving important problems. Marcus Thornton entered my life during the first week of graduate school in Professor Reed's advanced seminar on machine learning applications. The seminar was small, only 12 students selected based on their undergraduate research and academic performance. Marcus stood out immediately, not because his technical knowledge was superior to everyone else's, but because he possessed charisma and confidence that drew attention naturally. He asked questions that sounded intelligent, even when they revealed gaps in his understanding. He made connections between concepts that were sometimes insightful and sometimes superficial, but were always articulated in ways that sounded compelling. I was not immediately attracted to Marcus romantically. My initial impression was that he was probably very smart but definitely very aware of how smart he appeared to be, the kind of person who enjoyed intellectual performance as much as actual intellectual work. But Professor Reed assigned us to work together on a research project, exploring novel architectures for deep learning systems that could process multiple data types simultaneously. The project required combining theoretical knowledge with practical implementation, designing systems on paper, and then actually building working prototypes that could be tested and evaluated. Working closely with Marcus over several weeks revealed dimensions of his personality that were not visible in classroom settings. He was genuinely excited about the potential applications of machine learning technology, constantly thinking about how research concepts could be translated into products that would solve real problems for actual users. His mind worked differently from mine in ways that turned out to be complementary. Where I focused on technical elegance and theoretical soundness, he focused on practical application and market potential. Where I wanted to understand why something worked at a fundamental level, he wanted to know who would pay for it and how it could scale to serve millions of users. Our research project was successful beyond what Professor Reed had expected from graduate students. We designed a neural network architecture that could process text, images, and structured data simultaneously, learning representations that captured relationships across different data types in ways that existing systems struggled with. We built a working prototype and tested it on several benchmark datasets, achieving results that were competitive with much more complex systems developed by corporate research labs with far greater resources. Professor Reed encouraged us to submit our work to a top-tier conference, and when the paper was accepted, she suggested we consider pursuing patents and potentially founding a company to commercialize the technology. I was resistant to the idea of leaving academia for entrepreneurship. I had finally found an environment where I felt intellectually challenged and respected for my contributions, where people cared about elegant solutions and theoretical understanding, rather than just whatever generated profit most quickly. But Marcus was immediately enthusiastic about the possibility of turning our research into a commercial product. He spent hours sketching out business models and market analyses, identifying potential customers and competitors, thinking about how we could raise funding and build a team and scale operations. His excitement was contagious even though I had reservations about abandoning academic research for the uncertainty of a startup. Marcus argued that we could have more impact through a successful company than through academic papers that would be read by a few hundred researchers and then forgotten. He painted a vision of technology that would be used by millions of people, systems that would power applications and services that made people's lives genuinely better in tangible ways. He talked about hiring talented engineers and researchers who would work on cutting-edge problems, creating an environment that combined the intellectual rigor of academia with the resources and scale of industry. He made entrepreneurship sound like the logical extension of research rather than a betrayal of academic values. We started dating somewhere in the middle of those intense conversations about whether to pursue commercialization of our research. The transition from research partners to romantic partners happened gradually and felt natural at the time. We were spending 12 to 15 hours a day together anyway, working in the lab or grabbing meals between meetings or staying up late debugging code and discussing strategy. The intellectual connection became an emotional connection, became a physical connection. By the time we officially incorporated Marcus's company during our second year of graduate school, we were living together in a small apartment in Capitol Hill and planning both a business and a life as partners in every sense. Those early years of building the company, while finishing our graduate degrees, were exhausting but exhilarating. We worked constantly, sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, surviving on coffee and takeout food, writing code and pitching investors and recruiting early employees. Marcus was the public face of the company, the charismatic founder who could walk into a room of venture capitalists and convince them to write checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars based on little more than a compelling vision and a working prototype. I was the technical foundation, the person who actually built the systems Marcus described in investor meetings, who debugged problems at 3 in the morning when demonstrations failed before important presentations, who mentored the junior engineers we hired as the team slowly expanded. My name was on all the founding documents as co-founder and chief technology officer. Marcus was chief executive officer, the role that matched his skills and interests. We owned equal equity stakes initially, both of us holding 40% of the company with the remaining 20% reserved for future employees and advisors. We made decisions together about product direction and hiring and company strategy. Marcus valued my technical judgment and deferred to my expertise on architectural decisions and engineering priorities. I felt genuinely respected and valued as an equal partner building something meaningful. When Marcus proposed to me 3 years after we started the company, on a Sunday morning in our apartment with coffee and pancakes and no ring yet because he wanted me to pick something I actually liked, I said yes without any hesitation or doubt. I believed completely that we were building both a successful company and a strong marriage as partners who brought complementary skills to shared goals. I believed Marcus when he said I made him better, that my technical depth balanced his strategic vision, that together we were more capable than either of us could be alone. I believed we were creating something that belonged to both of us equally because we had built it together from nothing. Our wedding was small and simple, held at a historic chapel in downtown Seattle with about 50 guests including family, close friends, and a few early employees who had become like family through the intense shared experience of building a startup. My father walked me down the aisle with pride in his eyes that made me cry before I even reached the altar. Marcus looked handsome and happy in a suit we had purchased together on sale, and when he said his vows about partnership and mutual support and building a life together, I believed every word without question or reservation. We honeymooned in Vancouver for 4 days because that was all the time we could afford to be away from the company, but those 4 days felt like a complete break from the intense pressure of startup life. The first real shift in our relationship came about a year after our wedding when Marcus decided to raise a significant round of venture capital funding. The company was growing and needed capital to hire more engineers, expand the sales team, and invest in infrastructure that would allow us to serve larger enterprise customers. I understood the business logic and agreed we needed funding. What I did not fully understand until the funding closed was how venture capital fundamentally changes ownership structure and power dynamics within companies. Marcus negotiated the investment terms himself with minimal input from me. He explained that investors wanted clean decision-making authority, and that having 2 people with equal equity and equal control would make governance complicated. He suggested that he should hold slightly more equity and formal decision-making authority as CEO, while I would maintain my CTO role and significant equity stake. The difference seemed small on paper, a few percentage points that Marcus assured me would not change our actual partnership or my role in company decisions. I trusted him and signed the documents without extensive review or independent legal counsel, because he was my husband and our interests were supposed to be aligned. That funding round was the first of several, each one diluting my ownership stake further while preserving Marcus's controlling position through carefully structured terms I did not fully understand until much later. Within 3 years of our wedding, I owned less than 5% of the company I had co-founded while Marcus maintained over 20%, plus special voting rights that gave him ultimate authority over major decisions. He had brought in experienced executives like Alexis Chun who reported directly to him and formed an inner circle I was increasingly excluded from. He made strategic decisions without consulting me, and then informed me of those decisions as settled matters rather than topics open for discussion. When I objected or tried to reassert my role as co-founder and technical leader, Marcus had sophisticated responses ready. He explained that companies at our stage needed clear hierarchy and decision-making authority, rather than consensus-driven processes that worked in early stages, but did not scale. He pointed to successful technology companies where founding teams had similar structures with one person holding clear CEO authority. He suggested that my desire to be involved in every decision reflected a lack of trust in him and the executive team he had assembled. He praised my technical contributions while making clear those contributions were becoming less central as the company matured beyond the initial product development phase. Gradually, incrementally, in ways that seemed reasonable when examined individually but formed a troubling pattern when viewed collectively, I was pushed out of meaningful participation in the company I had helped create. My title remained the same. My equity stake, though dramatically diluted, was still worth significant money on paper. I still attended board meetings and executive gatherings, but I was no longer making decisions or setting direction or even being consulted before major strategic shifts occurred. I had become decorative leadership, someone whose presence suggested technical credibility and founding legitimacy, but whose actual influence had been systematically eliminated. The worst part was how effectively Marcus made me complicit in my own marginalization. Every step of the process came with explanations that sounded logical and reasonable. Every concern I raised was met with reassurance that my contributions were valued even as the structure of the company made those contributions increasingly peripheral. Every time I considered fighting harder for equal partnership, Marcus reminded me that the company was succeeding beyond our original dreams, and that success required different structures than we had needed in the beginning. He made me feel ungrateful for questioning decisions that were producing undeniable results. I began focusing more energy on my consulting practice, building websites and applications for small businesses and nonprofit organizations that could not afford the enterprise software Marcus's company sold to Fortune 500 corporations. The work was satisfying in its own way, direct and personal with clients who genuinely appreciated what I built for them. But it was also small in scale and impact compared to what Marcus was building, and I could not help comparing my modest consulting revenue to the hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through the company I had co-founded but no longer truly belonged to. Our marriage shifted along with our professional relationship. Marcus was constantly traveling, meeting with investors and customers and partners in Silicon Valley and New York and international markets. When he was home, he was distracted and exhausted, checking email during meals and taking calls at odd hours to accommodate different time zones. We stopped having meaningful conversations about the future or about what we wanted from our life together. We became roommates who occasionally attended social events together and maintained the appearance of a successful marriage without much actual connection or intimacy. I told myself this was normal, that all couples went through periods of distance and disconnection, that the intense pressure of building a successful company naturally limited time and energy available for relationship maintenance. I told myself things would improve once the company stabilized or once Marcus felt less pressure to constantly grow and expand and compete. I told myself that my equity stake in the company would eventually provide financial security that would make all the sacrifices worthwhile. I became expert at rationalizing away my own unhappiness and convincing myself that supporting Marcus's success was the same as building our shared success. By our 10th anniversary, I had spent several years living a life that looked perfect from outside, but felt hollow and unsatisfying from within. I attended elegant events wearing expensive clothes and made appropriate small talk with influential people, while feeling completely disconnected from the person I had been when I first walked into Professor Reed's seminar full of excitement about machine learning and confidence in my own technical abilities. I had become the decorative furniture Marcus would eventually accuse me of being, not because that was my nature but because I had gradually accepted limitations and diminished expectations until they became self-fulfilling prophecies. When Marcus announced the 10th anniversary gala at the Crystal Pavilion, I suggested something more intimate. Perhaps dinner with our closest friends at a restaurant we loved, or a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands where we could actually spend time together without performing for an audience. But Marcus insisted on the large formal event, explaining that people in our position were expected to celebrate milestones in ways that matched our success and status. He made it sound like the party was something we were doing for the community rather than for ourselves, a social obligation rather than a personal celebration. I spent weeks helping plan every detail even though event coordinators were handling most of the actual work. I attended tastings for food and wine. I reviewed invitation lists and seating arrangements. I coordinated with Marcus's assistant on scheduling and logistics. I purchased the emerald silk gown from Paris and borrowed diamonds from a private collection, and had my hair styled professionally. I did everything expected of me as the successful entrepreneur's wife, hosting an important social event. I performed the role perfectly while feeling increasingly disconnected from any authentic sense of self or purpose. The night before the gala, I stood in our bedroom trying on the finished gown and feeling a wave of disconnection so strong it made me physically dizzy. The woman in the mirror looked successful and elegant and exactly right for the event we were hosting. But I did not recognize her. I could not remember when I had stopped being Victoria Chan, the brilliant computer science researcher, and become Victoria Thornton, the decorative wife who attended parties and looked good in photographs. I touched the mirror wondering who this stranger was, and how she had replaced the person I used to be. I should have trusted that feeling. I should have recognized it as my authentic self trying to communicate that something was fundamentally wrong with the life I was living. But instead I smoothed the expensive dress and practiced my smile, and prepared to celebrate a marriage that I believed was real even though it had been hollow for years. I walked into that ballroom the next evening with no idea that my life was about to be destroyed in the most public way possible, and that the destruction would ultimately become the catalyst for reclaiming the person I had lost somewhere along the way. The erosion of my identity and agency within my marriage to Marcus Thornton did not happen suddenly or obviously. It occurred through a series of small adjustments and compromises that seemed reasonable in isolation, but created a dangerous pattern when viewed collectively over time. Understanding how I became the woman standing in that ballroom requires examining the incremental changes that transformed an equal partnership into a relationship where one person held all the power while the other provided decorative support. Each step seemed logical at the moment it occurred, which is precisely what made the overall trajectory so difficult to recognize until the damage was already extensive and deeply embedded. The first significant shift came approximately 18 months after our wedding when Marcus hired Alexis Chan as the company's chief operating officer. The decision made perfect business sense at the time and I supported it without reservation. Our company was growing rapidly and needed someone with experience scaling operations and managing complex organizations. Alexis had worked at Microsoft for 8 years in progressively senior roles before joining a successful startup that had recently been acquired by Amazon. She understood enterprise sales and customer relationship management, and the operational infrastructure required to serve large corporate clients. Her resume was impressive and her references were glowing. Marcus presented the hiring decision as something we were making together as co-founders, discussing Alexis's qualifications and asking for my input during the interview process. I met with her several times and found her intelligent and competent, someone who clearly knew how to execute at scale in ways that neither Marcus nor I had direct experience with. I agreed she would be an excellent addition to our executive team and supported offering her a generous compensation package including significant equity to convince her to leave her stable position for the uncertainty of joining a growing startup. What I did not recognize at the time was how Alexis's arrival would fundamentally alter the dynamics of decision-making within the company and within my marriage. Almost immediately, Marcus began spending enormous amounts of time with Alexis working on operational strategy and organizational design. They met early in the mornings before I arrived at the office. They had working dinners several evenings each week. They traveled together to meet with potential customers and investors. The time Marcus and I had previously spent discussing company strategy and making decisions together was gradually transferred to his relationship with Alexis. When I raised concerns about being excluded from important discussions, Marcus had reasonable explanations ready. He explained that Alexis needed intensive onboarding and mentoring to understand our technology and market position. He pointed out that operational decisions were her domain of expertise, and that involving too many people in those discussions would slow down execution. He reminded me that my strengths were technical rather than operational, and that the most valuable use of my time was leading the engineering team, rather than attending meetings about sales processes and customer success metrics. Each explanation made sense individually. Alexis did need onboarding. Operational efficiency was her area of expertise rather than mine. My technical leadership was genuinely valuable to the company. But the cumulative effect of these reasonable explanations was that I was systematically excluded from strategic decisions, while Marcus and Alexis formed a tight partnership that left no room for my participation. They developed their own shorthand and shared references. They made jokes I did not understand because they referenced conversations I had not been part of. They built a professional intimacy that excluded me while remaining entirely defensible, as necessary for effective business operations. The second major shift occurred when Marcus decided to pursue a Series B funding round about 2 years after our wedding. The company had grown to approximately 50 employees and was generating several $1 million in annual revenue. But Marcus had ambitious plans for expansion that required significant capital investment. He wanted to hire aggressively, expand into international markets, and invest in product development that would position us to compete with much larger established companies. The strategic vision made sense, and I supported pursuing additional funding to accelerate growth. What I did not understand until the funding closed was how venture capital term sheets could be structured to concentrate power and control with specific individuals while diluting others. Marcus worked with our investors and their lawyers to negotiate terms that gave him special voting rights and board representation, while treating my equity stake as standard common stock without enhanced control provisions. He explained this as a standard practice where investors wanted clear single decision-maker authority vested in the CEO, rather than shared power that might create governance conflicts or slow down critical decisions. The explanation sounded logical and professional. I had read articles about venture-backed companies where founding teams fought over control, and how those conflicts damaged company performance and investor confidence. I trusted Marcus as my husband and business partner to negotiate terms that protected our mutual interests. I signed documents that my lawyer reviewed only cursorily because I believed Marcus when he said the terms were standard and reasonable. I did not understand that I was signing away formal authority over a company I had helped create based on assurances from someone whose interests were increasingly diverging from my own. After that funding round closed, Marcus began making major strategic decisions without consulting me at all. He would announce hirings or product pivots or partnership agreements as settled matters rather than as topics requiring discussion or input from the broader leadership team. When I objected that he had not involved me in decisions that significantly affected the technical architecture or engineering priorities, he pointed out that as CEO he had both the authority and the responsibility to make those decisions expeditiously. He suggested that my desire to be consulted on everything reflected outdated thinking about how the company needed to operate at our current scale. I found myself in an impossible position. If I pushed back too aggressively on being excluded from decisions, Marcus characterized me as difficult or unwilling to accept how companies needed to evolve as they grew. If I accepted the exclusion quietly, I was implicitly agreeing that my role should be limited to executing technical decisions Marcus made rather than participating as an equal partner in strategic leadership. Either response reinforced the narrative Marcus was building that I was a talented technical contributor, but not someone who should be involved in the highest level strategy and direction setting. The third significant shift happened gradually over several years as Marcus systematically brought in experienced executives from larger technology companies and gave them authority that superseded mine in areas I had previously owned. He hired a new vice president of engineering who reported directly to him, rather than to me despite my title as Chief Technology Officer. He brought in a head of product who made decisions about feature priorities and roadmap without meaningful input from the engineering team I theoretically led. He created an executive leadership team that met weekly to discuss strategy and operations, meetings where my participation became increasingly optional, and then eventually stopped being expected at all. Each hiring decision made sense individually when Marcus explained his reasoning. The company needed people with experience scaling engineering organizations beyond what I had directly managed. Product decisions require balancing technical feasibility with market demands and customer needs in ways that required dedicated expertise. The executive team needed to move quickly on operational matters without getting bogged down in technical details that slowed decision-making. Every explanation was logical and professionally sound. The cumulative effect was that I was pushed out of meaningful leadership, while my title remained unchanged and my equity stake continued appearing on organizational charts as evidence of founding legitimacy. I began to notice that Marcus spoke about me differently in professional settings, subtle shifts in language that changed how others perceived my role and contributions. In early years, he had referred to us as co-founders who built the company together and made decisions as partners. Gradually, his language shifted to emphasize his own vision and leadership, while characterizing my contributions as primarily technical execution of strategies he developed. In investor meetings and media interviews, he spoke about the architecture and engineering choices as his decisions rather than as collaborative work we had done together. He praised my technical skills while implicitly positioning me as someone who implemented his ideas rather than someone who generated ideas of equal importance. The changes in professional dynamics inevitably affected our marriage. Marcus was spending most of his waking hours with Alexis and other executives who formed his inner circle. When he was home, he was exhausted and distracted, responding to emails and taking calls rather than engaging in meaningful conversation with me. We stopped having substantive discussions about the future, or about our relationship, or about what we wanted from our life together beyond the immediate demands of company operations. We functioned as roommates who occasionally attended social events together, and maintained the appearance of a successful partnership, without much actual intimacy or connection. I tried multiple times to initiate serious conversations about the distance growing between us, and about my concerns regarding being systematically excluded from the company we had supposedly built together. Marcus responded to these attempts at genuine communication with a combination of reassurance and dismissal that left me feeling confused and increasingly isolated. He would acknowledge that we had been busy and distant lately while promising things would improve once we got through whatever current intense period of growth or product launch or fundraising was consuming all available time and energy. He would praise my technical contributions while deflecting concerns about power dynamics and decision-making authority as misunderstandings about how companies needed to operate at scale. The most insidious aspect of this gradual corruption was how Marcus made me complicit in my own marginalization, by constantly questioning whether my concerns were legitimate, or whether I was being oversensitive, and failing to understand normal business evolution. He was skilled at presenting his perspective in ways that sounded rational and reasonable, while making my objections seem emotional or rooted in personal insecurity, rather than legitimate concerns about equity and partnership. Over time, I internalized his characterization and began doubting my own perceptions and judgments about what was happening. I started telling myself stories that justified accepting a diminished role in both the company and the marriage. I convinced myself that supporting Marcus's success was the same as building our shared success, since we were married and theoretically had aligned interests. I rationalized that my equity stake, though significantly diluted, would eventually be worth substantial money if the company continued growing successfully. I accepted that some relationships went through extended periods of distance and disconnection, and that this was normal for ambitious professionals building significant careers. I became expert at explaining away my own unhappiness and convincing myself that the situation was acceptable or at least temporary. My consulting practice became an escape and a way to maintain some sense of professional identity independent of my increasingly peripheral role in Marcus's company. I built websites and custom applications for small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and individual entrepreneurs who needed technical expertise, but could not afford enterprise software or large development firms. The work was satisfying in immediate tangible ways that my role in Marcus's company had stopped being. My consulting clients genuinely appreciated what I built for them. They valued my technical judgment and creative problem solving. They treated me as an expert whose opinion mattered rather than as someone whose contributions were primarily decorative. But I was also aware that my consulting practice was small in scale and impact compared to what Marcus was building. My annual revenue from consulting was perhaps $200,000 in a good year. Respectable for an independent consultant but trivial compared to the tens of millions of dollars flowing through Marcus's company. I was building functional websites for local bakeries and custom inventory management systems for small retailers, while Marcus was closing deals with Fortune 500 corporations, and raising hundreds of millions in venture capital. The contrast was impossible to ignore and contributed to my sense that perhaps Marcus was right about our respective capabilities and appropriate roles. I maintained friendships with people from graduate school and from the early years of building the company, but those relationships became increasingly strained as my life diverged from theirs, and as I became less willing to honestly discuss what was happening in my marriage and professional situation. Jennifer remained my closest friend, flying down from where she worked in San Francisco several times a year and maintaining regular phone contact. But even with Jennifer, I found myself performing a version of contentment, rather than admitting how disconnected and diminished I felt in my own life. Jennifer would ask careful questions about whether I was happy, whether Marcus was treating me well, whether I felt fulfilled in my work and relationship. I would give carefully constructed answers that acknowledged challenges while insisting things were fundamentally fine. I was protecting Marcus and protecting my own ego and protecting the image of success we had constructed together. Admitting that I had allowed myself to become decorative furniture in my own life felt too painful and too revealing of what I interpreted as personal failure. It seemed easier to maintain the performance of satisfaction than to acknowledge the reality of systematic marginalization. My relationship with my parents became similarly performative during this period. They were proud of my apparent success, proud that I had married someone who built a significant company, proud that I lived in a beautiful house on the waterfront and attended elegant social events. My mother would tell her friends about her daughter, the technology executive, who was married to a successful entrepreneur. My father would ask questions about the company and seem genuinely impressed by the scale of what Marcus was building. They saw the external markers of success and had no window into the internal reality of gradual erasure and systematic exclusion. I did not have language to explain to my parents or to myself what was actually happening. I understood intellectually that I was being pushed out of the company I had co-founded, but I had accepted Marcus's framing that this was normal evolution rather than deliberate marginalization. I recognized that my marriage had become hollow and distant, but I had internalized the narrative that demanding professionals necessarily sacrifice relationship intimacy for career success. I felt increasingly unhappy and disconnected, but could not articulate exactly what was wrong, or what should change because Marcus had convinced me that the problem was my unrealistic expectations, rather than his systematic undermining of our partnership. The gradual corruption of my professional role and personal relationship continued over several years, with each small adjustment seeming manageable in isolation, while the cumulative pattern created a situation that was fundamentally unsustainable. By the time Marcus announced plans for our 10th anniversary gala, I had spent years accepting limitations and diminished expectations, and reduced participation in decisions affecting my own life. I had become someone who asked permission implicitly rather than claiming authority, who accepted being talked over in meetings rather than demanding to be heard, who smiled through social events while feeling completely disconnected from the conversations and people around me. When I suggested we celebrate our anniversary with something intimate and personal rather than a large formal gala, Marcus dismissed my preference with explanations about social obligations and community expectations. He made it clear that the decision had already been made, and that my role was to participate gracefully in the event he had planned rather than to negotiate about what kind of celebration we would have. I accepted his decision without significant resistance, because I had trained myself over years to accept that Marcus's preferences and judgments superseded my own in virtually every domain of our shared life. I spent weeks planning details for an event I had not wanted, performing the role of gracious hostess, preparing an elegant celebration, while feeling increasingly disconnected from any authentic sense of self or agency. I made myself beautiful in ways that required professional help and expensive adornments. I practiced appropriate conversation and prepared to smile through hours of superficial social interaction with people who saw me primarily as Marcus Thornton's wife, rather than as an individual with my own identity and accomplishments. I did everything expected of me without acknowledging even to myself how much I had lost in the process of becoming the person who would stand in that ballroom and accept public humiliation without having any framework to understand why it was happening or what I had done to deserve such spectacular betrayal. The 10th anniversary gala at the Crystal Pavilion was not a spontaneous event or a simple celebration that grew larger than originally intended. It was a carefully orchestrated production designed to serve purposes I did not understand until much later, When I had sufficient distance and information to recognize the deliberate architecture of what Marcus had constructed. Every detail of that evening had been planned with precision, from the guest list to the venue selection to the timing of speeches and announcements. What I experienced as our anniversary celebration was actually Marcus Thornton's carefully staged transition from one phase of his life to another, with me cast in the role of the obstacle being publicly removed, so he could proceed unencumbered toward whatever future he had planned. The planning for the gala began approximately 4 months before the actual event, which should have been my first indication that this was not a simple anniversary dinner. Marcus approached me one evening in late January, as I was working on a client website project in our home office. He stood in the doorway with the expression he typically wore when he had made a decision he expected me to accept without significant discussion. He explained that our 10th anniversary was approaching in May, and that he wanted to host a proper celebration at the Crystal Pavilion, a venue significant enough to match what we had accomplished together over the past decade. I had other ideas about how I wanted to celebrate our anniversary. I suggested we take a week away from Seattle, perhaps traveling to British Columbia or flying to Hawaii, somewhere we could actually spend time together without the constant interruption of work demands and social obligations. I proposed hosting an intimate dinner with our closest friends and family, maybe 20 people at a restaurant we loved, an evening focused on genuine connection rather than performance and spectacle. I mentioned that we had not taken a real vacation together in over 2 years, and that time alone might be more meaningful than another event where we would spend the evening making small talk with people we saw regularly at other professional gatherings. Marcus listened to my suggestions with the patient expression he used when hearing ideas he had already decided to reject. He explained that people in our position were expected to celebrate significant milestones in ways that reflected our success and standing in the community. He pointed out that our anniversary was not just a personal milestone but a business milestone as well, representing 10 years since we had started building something significant together. He suggested that a major celebration would be an opportunity to strengthen relationships with investors, customers, and partners, while also demonstrating to the broader Seattle technology community that we were leaders worth paying attention to. The way Marcus framed the event made my preferences sound small and selfish. Of course, we could take a vacation together at some point when work was less demanding, he assured me, but this particular milestone deserved public recognition commensurate with what we had achieved. Of course, intimate dinners with friends were valuable, but we had responsibilities to the broader community that had supported our success and helped make the company viable. His arguments were structured to make dissent seem like a failure to understand the social obligations that came with success, a failure to appreciate what the event could accomplish beyond simple personal celebration. I agreed to the Crystal Pavilion Gala without enthusiastic support, but also without significant resistance. I had learned over years of marriage that sustained disagreement with Marcus on decisions he considered important was exhausting and ultimately futile. He would find ways to characterize my objections as emotional or irrational or rooted in failure to understand how things actually worked at our level of success. It seemed easier to accept his vision for our anniversary than to fight a battle I knew I would eventually lose while being made to feel unreasonable for wanting something different. Once I had agreed in principle to a large formal event, Marcus delegated the detailed planning to his executive assistant Rebecca, and to an event planning firm that specialized in high-profile corporate and social gatherings. I was included in planning meetings and asked for my input on various decisions, but it quickly became clear that the major frameworks had already been established before my involvement began. The venue was booked. The approximate budget was set. The general structure of the evening was determined. My role was to make selections within parameters Marcus and Rebecca had already defined rather than to shape the event according to my own vision or preferences. The guest list was the first major element where I began to feel uneasy about the nature of what we were planning. Rebecca presented me with a preliminary list of approximately 300 people, which seemed excessive for an anniversary celebration. When I questioned the size, Marcus explained that we needed to include his investors, board members, key customers, important partners, and influential members of Seattle's technology and business community, along with our actual friends and family. He characterized the event as serving multiple purposes simultaneously: personal milestone, business relationship building, and public demonstration of success and leadership within our industry and city. I reviewed the guest list and recognized perhaps 30% of the names as people I actually knew or had relationships with independent of Marcus's business. The remaining 70% were people I had met briefly at various professional events, people whose names I recognized from media coverage of Seattle's technology sector, or people I had never heard of at all but who apparently mattered to Marcus's business and social ambitions. The ratio of actual friends to strategic business contacts made clear that this event was primarily professional, rather than personal regardless of how Marcus described it. When I raised this concern with Marcus, pointing out that our anniversary celebration seemed to have become a corporate networking event, he responded with a combination of reassurance and subtle accusation that I was being unsupportive. He acknowledged that the guest list included many business contacts, but insisted these were people who had been important to our success and deserved to be included in celebrating what we had built. He suggested that my discomfort with celebrating our professional achievements alongside our personal milestone revealed a lack of appreciation for how interconnected those dimensions of our life actually were. He made me feel small and ungrateful for questioning the structure of an event he was ostensibly creating to honor our marriage. I stopped objecting and focused instead on the specific decisions where Rebecca requested my input. I selected menu options from choices the catering company proposed. I reviewed flower arrangements and centerpiece designs. I approved invitation wording that Marcus and Rebecca had drafted. I chose between fabric swatches for linens and considered different lighting schemes for the ballroom. I made countless small decisions while having no real influence over the fundamental nature of what we were creating. The dress selection process revealed another dimension of how thoroughly Marcus was controlling the narrative and presentation of the evening. He insisted I needed something extraordinary, rather than simply purchasing a nice gown from a department store or local boutique. He suggested we plan a trip to Paris specifically so I could work with a designer who created custom pieces for wealthy clients and celebrities. The suggestion seemed excessive to me, but Marcus framed it as an investment in how we presented ourselves publicly, and as an opportunity to spend time together traveling despite our busy schedules. We flew to Paris for a long weekend in March, ostensibly to select my anniversary gown but actually spending most of our time with Marcus attending meetings with potential European customers and partners. I had 3 appointments with the designer, each lasting several hours as we discussed fabrics and silhouettes, and how the dress should photograph under various lighting conditions. The designer asked detailed questions about the venue and the event's purpose and the impression I wanted to create. Marcus sat in on 2 of the 3 appointments, offering opinions about what would look sophisticated and appropriate and memorable. The dress the designer created was objectively beautiful, an emerald silk gown with architectural structure that photographed extremely well and looked expensive enough to match the setting we were planning for. But it did not feel like something I would have chosen for myself. The design was more formal and dramatic than my natural aesthetic preferences. The color was selected to complement the Crystal Pavilion's interior, rather than based on what I actually liked, or what suited my complexion particularly well. The dress was created for the event Marcus was orchestrating rather than for me as an individual with my own taste and identity. I returned to Paris twice more for fittings as the designer made adjustments to ensure the dress fit perfectly. Each trip felt excessive and self-indulgent in ways that made me uncomfortable. I was spending more time and money on a single dress than many people earned in 6 months of work. I was flying internationally multiple times for fabric adjustments while my parents had never left North America, and considered a weekend trip to Seattle from Spokane a significant travel expense. The disconnect between the life I was living and the values I had been raised with became more stark with each first-class flight to Paris for another dress fitting. The jewelry for the evening was not something I owned, but rather pieces borrowed from a private collection that specialized in lending high-value items to wealthy clients for significant events. Marcus arranged this through connections he had developed in Seattle's social elite circles, relationships with people who moved in worlds of inherited wealth and social prestige, rather than the technology entrepreneurship community where we had originally made our mark. The diamonds and emeralds I would wear were insured for $500,000 for the single evening they would be in my possession. I had to sign detailed contracts accepting liability for any damage or loss, and agreeing to security provisions that seemed more appropriate for a heist movie than for borrowing jewelry for a party. Everything about the preparation for the gala felt performative and disconnected from anything authentic about my relationship with Marcus or our actual life together. We were creating a spectacle designed to project success and sophistication, and belonging among Seattle's elite, rather than celebrating 10 years of genuine partnership and shared experience. But I participated in all of it because I had lost the capacity to distinguish between what I actually wanted and what Marcus had convinced me I should want. I had internalized his perspective so thoroughly that my own discomfort registered only as vague unease rather than clear objection I could articulate or defend. The week before the event, Marcus became noticeably more tense and distracted than usual. He spent long hours at his office and came home late with explanations about urgent business matters requiring immediate attention. He took phone calls at odd hours and stepped out of rooms for private conversations. His behavior seemed consistent with how he typically acted during stressful periods of company operations, so I attributed the tension to normal work pressure rather than recognizing it as evidence that something more significant was happening. What I did not know during that final week before the gala was that Marcus was coordinating extensively with Alexis Chan on the logistics of what would actually occur during the event. They were rehearsing timing and messaging. They were ensuring that key investors and board members were prepared for the announcement Marcus planned to make. They were managing the sequence of events down to the minute, so that everything would unfold according to the script Marcus had written for my public humiliation and his simultaneous launch of a new chapter of his life. The day of the gala itself felt surreal in ways I could not quite articulate. Professional hair and makeup artists arrived at our house at noon to begin the lengthy process of making me look perfect for the evening. A photographer was scheduled to arrive at 4 to take formal portraits before we left for the venue. Rebecca was coordinating final logistics with the event planning company and the catering team and the audiovisual contractors. Everything was proceeding according to detailed plans that had been refined over 4 months of preparation. I spent hours sitting in a chair while skilled professionals worked on my appearance, transforming me into a version of myself that looked polished and elegant, but felt artificial and unfamiliar. The woman who gradually appeared in the mirror was beautiful in a careful constructed way, her hair arranged in an elaborate updo that required dozens of pins and significant amounts of product to maintain. Her makeup applied with professional precision to photograph well under various lighting conditions, her overall presentation designed to convey sophistication and success rather than any authentic personal aesthetic. Marcus appeared periodically throughout the afternoon to check on preparations and make approving comments about how beautiful I looked. His attention felt distant and performative, like he was reviewing a product being prepared for market rather than appreciating his wife on their anniversary. But I attributed this to stress about the event and to his general tendency toward being distracted by business concerns. I did not recognize that his emotional distance was strategic rather than circumstantial, that he was already separating himself psychologically from me in preparation for the separation he would announce publicly that evening. The photographer took formal portraits of us in our formal attire, Marcus in his custom tuxedo, and me in the emerald silk gown with the borrowed diamonds and emeralds. We posed together in various locations around our house and grounds, smiling and touching in ways that suggested intimacy and connection we no longer actually shared. The photographs would be beautiful and would convey exactly the impression Marcus wanted. Successful couple celebrating significant milestone, powerful man with elegant wife, technology entrepreneur who had achieved both professional success and personal stability. Looking at those photographs later, after everything had fallen apart, I would be struck by how completely they misrepresented the reality of our relationship. The images showed a couple who appeared happy and connected. The actual experience of being photographed involved following instructions from a professional about how to position our bodies and arrange our expressions. There was no genuine emotion in those portraits, just two people performing roles for documentation that would serve purposes I did not yet understand. We arrived at the Crystal Pavilion at 6:30, 30 minutes before guests were scheduled to begin arriving. Rebecca was already there coordinating with venue staff and ensuring everything was arranged exactly according to the detailed plans. The ballroom looked spectacular, crystal chandeliers casting fractured light across polished floors, elaborate flower arrangements on every table, views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains providing dramatic backdrop to the elegant space. Everything was perfect in the aesthetic sense while feeling completely disconnected from anything meaningful about my actual relationship with Marcus. Guests began arriving promptly at 7, and Marcus and I stood together near the entrance greeting people as they came in. I I shook hands and made small talk, and thanked people for attending while feeling increasingly disconnected from what was happening around me. Marcus was in his element, confident and charming and clearly enjoying the attention and the social performance. He introduced me repeatedly as his wife, sometimes adding brief references to my technical work but more often simply positioning me as his spouse without substantial independent identity. The evening proceeded exactly according to the schedule Rebecca had distributed to relevant parties. Cocktails and appetizers. Transition to the main ballroom. Seated dinner with carefully arranged table assignments. The food was excellent and the wine was expensive, and the conversation at our table was pleasant in a superficial way that required no genuine engagement or authenticity. I performed my role adequately, smiling and laughing at appropriate moments and responding to questions with practiced answers that revealed nothing substantial about my actual thoughts or feelings. Between the fourth and fifth courses came the speeches that Marcus had planned as the centerpiece of the evening. I had known speeches were scheduled but had assumed they would be brief toasts from friends and family, charming stories about our relationship and warm wishes for our future together. I had not imagined that Marcus was planning to use this moment for purposes that had nothing to do with celebrating our marriage, and everything to do with staging his transition to the next phase of his carefully constructed life. When Marcus stood to speak, I smiled up at him with what I assumed was appropriate wifely affection and pride. I expected him to tell some amusing anecdote about our early years together, or to thank me for supporting his career, or to express sentiment about our partnership and future. I was completely unprepared for what he would actually say, for the deliberate cruelty of using our anniversary celebration as the venue for my public destruction, and his simultaneous announcement of a new partnership with the woman who had been systematically replacing me for years. Everything that happened after Marcus began speaking would replay in my mind thousands of times over the following months. But in the moment itself, all I felt was shock and disconnection. Like I was watching something happen to someone else rather than experiencing my own life being destroyed in front of 500 carefully selected witnesses. Marcus had planned every element of that evening with precision, creating the perfect stage for his performance of ending one chapter and beginning another without any private conversation or warning or acknowledgement that I deserved more consideration than he gave to business transactions he negotiated regularly. The moment Marcus began speaking with that shift in tone, moving from gracious acknowledgement of our guests to something darker and more calculated, I felt my body respond before my mind fully processed what was happening. My heart rate accelerated and my hands went cold despite the warmth of the crowded ballroom. Some primal part of my nervous system recognized danger before my conscious mind could articulate what that danger was or where it was coming from. I sat frozen in my chair while Marcus continued speaking, my smile still fixed on my face, even as everything inside me began to understand that whatever was about to happen would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life. When Marcus said the words about me being decorative furniture, about needing a true partner who could contribute meaningfully rather than simply existing alongside his success, the shock was so complete that for several seconds I genuinely could not process what my ears had clearly heard. My brain kept trying to reinterpret the words into something less devastating, searching for alternative meanings that would make sense in the context of an anniversary celebration. Perhaps this was some elaborate joke that would be revealed as such in the next sentence. Perhaps I had misheard or misunderstood what he actually said. Perhaps this was a nightmare I would wake from momentarily and discover none of it had actually happened. But the silence that followed his statement confirmed that everyone else in the ballroom had heard exactly what I heard and understood exactly what it meant. 500 people sat completely still, their shock and discomfort visible on faces turned toward our table with expressions ranging from genuine sympathy to barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing spectacular social disaster. The silence was suffocating and absolute, broken only by the faint ambient sounds of the venue's climate control system and the distant noise of traffic from the street below. No one moved or spoke or seemed to breathe. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, how I would respond to being publicly humiliated by my own husband at our anniversary celebration. I looked at Marcus standing above me in the spotlight, and what I saw in his face was more devastating than the words he had just spoken. His expression showed no regret or discomfort or even anger. He looked calm and satisfied, like someone who had just executed a difficult business maneuver successfully, and was pleased with how smoothly everything had proceeded according to plan. He was not having an emotional breakdown or experiencing some kind of psychological crisis that might explain or excuse what he was doing. This was deliberate and calculated. A performance he had rehearsed and refined until he could deliver it with perfect composure in front of hundreds of witnesses. The realization that Marcus had planned this moment, that he had spent months orchestrating an anniversary celebration specifically to serve as the venue for my public destruction, was somehow more painful than the actual content of what he said. The cruelty was not just in the words themselves but in the elaborate staging, in the careful selection of witnesses who represented everyone important in Seattle's technology community, in the calculated timing that would ensure maximum impact and complete humiliation. He had turned what should have been an intimate moment of relationship transition into a public spectacle designed to serve his own purposes without any consideration for my dignity or well-being. Marcus continued speaking as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, moving seamlessly into his announcement about forming a strategic partnership with Alexis Chun. He used business language to describe what was clearly a personal relationship, talking about alignment of vision and complementary skills and the next phase of growth. But everyone in the ballroom understood immediately what was actually being announced. This was not simply a professional partnership. This was Marcus Thornton ending his marriage and beginning a new relationship with his chief operating officer, conducting both transitions simultaneously in a single coordinated public statement. When Alexis stood and walked to join Marcus in the spotlight, the full architecture of what had been happening for years suddenly became visible with devastating clarity. The way she moved to his side looked natural and practiced rather than awkward or uncertain. The way Marcus put his arm around her shoulders suggested a relationship that was established and comfortable rather than new and tentative. The way they looked at each other showed intimacy and familiarity that had obviously developed over extended time rather than suddenly emerging. They had been together for months at minimum, possibly years, conducting their relationship right in front of me while I remained oblivious or willfully blind to what was actually happening. Every late-night work session, every business trip they took together, every meeting I was excluded from suddenly took on new meaning. Marcus and Alexis had not just been building a professional partnership, while systematically pushing me out of meaningful participation in the company I co-founded. They had been building a personal relationship that was always intended to replace my marriage once Marcus decided the timing was right for public transition. I had been completely blind to the affair happening in plain sight because I trusted Marcus and believed his explanations about why he needed to spend so much time with Alexis, and why their working relationship necessarily excluded my participation. The betrayal was multi-layered and comprehensive. Marcus had stolen my role in the company I helped create, systematically eroding my authority and ownership, while preserving the appearance of my continued involvement as founding chief technology officer. He had conducted an affair with the woman he hired specifically to replace me professionally, their personal relationship developing in parallel with the professional displacement. He had planned this public announcement for months, turning our anniversary celebration into a carefully staged transition that served his purposes without any private conversation or warning that might have allowed me to prepare or at least avoid complete public humiliation. I sat motionless for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds, my mind struggling to process the complete destruction of everything I had believed about my life and my marriage. Part of me wanted to stand up and scream, to create a scene that would disrupt Marcus's carefully orchestrated performance and force everyone to acknowledge the cruelty of what was happening. Part of me wanted to simply disappear, to somehow cease existing in this moment so I would not have to feel the weight of 500 pairs of eyes watching my humiliation and judging my response. Part of me wanted to cry, to let the devastation show visibly on my face, so that at least people would understand I had not been complicit in this public destruction of my own dignity. But what actually moved me to action was something deeper and more fundamental than any of those emotional impulses. Some core part of my identity that Marcus had not managed to completely erase over years of systematic marginalization suddenly surged to the surface. That part of me refused to remain sitting in that chair looking like a victim waiting for rescue or collapse. That part of me demanded that I stand up and reclaim whatever small measure of dignity and agency was still available in this situation that Marcus had designed specifically to strip me of both. I stood slowly and deliberately, my emerald silk gown catching the light as I rose to my full height. The movement was controlled and purposeful rather than rushed or frantic. I wanted everyone in that ballroom to see that I was choosing to stand rather than being forced to my feet by the unbearable nature of remaining seated. I wanted Marcus to see that he had not broken me completely despite how thoroughly he had tried. I wanted to demonstrate that even in the midst of catastrophic betrayal and public humiliation, I retained the capacity to choose how I would respond and what I would project to the hundreds of witnesses watching my life implode in real time. I looked directly at Marcus, meeting his eyes with an expression I tried to keep neutral and assessing rather than devastated or pleading. I wanted him to see that I understood exactly what he had done and why he had done it. I wanted him to know that I recognized the calculated cruelty of using our anniversary as the stage for my destruction. I wanted him to see that I was not going to cry or beg or cause the kind of emotional scene that would give him ammunition for the narrative he was clearly building about me being unstable or difficult or unable to handle the realities of his success. I would not give him that satisfaction or that weapon to use against me in whatever battles were coming. Then I turned to address the 500 guests who were still sitting in shocked silence, waiting to see how the wife would respond to being publicly discarded by the powerful husband. My voice when I spoke was steadier than I expected given the adrenaline and shock coursing through my system. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, some reservoir of strength I had not known existed until the moment I needed to access it. I heard myself speaking with a clarity and composure that felt almost supernatural given the circumstances. I thanked Marcus for his honesty even while noting that his timing and venue were questionable. I wished him and Alexis success in their partnership, both business and personal. And then I said something that surprised even me in the moment, words that would end up defining the next chapter of my life in ways I could not have predicted when I spoke them. I invited everyone who had wondered what I actually did beyond appearing decorative at events like this to watch what I would build next. I promised them it would be far more interesting than anything they had seen from me so far. The promise was pure instinct rather than calculated strategy. I had no plan and no clear idea of what I would actually build or how I would build it. But in that moment, standing in front of hundreds of witnesses to my humiliation, I made a commitment that would either save me or destroy me depending on whether I could find the courage and capability to actually follow through. The alternative to making that promise was accepting Marcus's characterization of me as decorative and peripheral, as someone whose only value had been in supporting his success and looking appropriate beside him at social events. That acceptance was simply not available to me even in the midst of shock and devastation. I walked toward the ballroom exit with my head held high and my posture as perfect as I could maintain given that my legs felt weak and my hands were trembling slightly. My heels clicked against the marble floor in a steady rhythm that helped me focus on the simple mechanics of moving forward, rather than thinking about what had just happened, or what it meant. The crowd parted as I approached, people leaning back in their seats or standing to give me room to pass. Their faces showed various reactions that I registered without fully processing. Sympathy from some, discomfort from many, curiosity from others, and what looked disturbingly like satisfaction from a few who clearly enjoyed witnessing someone else's spectacular failure. The walk from our table to the ballroom exit was probably less than 100 feet but felt infinitely longer. Every step required conscious effort and deliberate choice to continue moving forward, rather than stopping or turning back, or simply collapsing under the weight of what I was experiencing. I was aware of Marcus behind me, probably watching my exit with that same calm, satisfied expression he had worn while destroying me publicly. I was aware of Alexis standing beside him in the spotlight, the woman who had systematically replaced me in every dimension of Marcus's life, while I remained oblivious to what was actually happening. I was aware of hundreds of people watching me leave, already forming opinions about what had occurred, and what it meant about my character and my marriage and my future. Jennifer caught up with me in the corridor outside the ballroom before I reached the elevators. She was crying openly even though I had not yet shed tears myself. Her distress on my behalf was touching, and would have broken through my carefully maintained composure if I had allowed myself to feel anything in that moment. But I could not afford emotional collapse while still in a building full of people who would witness and discuss every detail of my reaction. I needed to maintain control at least until I was completely alone and no longer visible to anyone who might report back to Marcus or to the broader Seattle technology community about how badly I was handling the destruction of my marriage. Jennifer asked the questions anyone would ask in her position. What had just happened? Had I known Marcus was going to do that? Where was I going? Could she help in any way? Her concern was genuine and her desire to support me was obvious. But I had no answers to give her because I was still struggling to process what had occurred myself. I could barely articulate thoughts beyond the immediate need to leave this building and be alone somewhere private where I could think clearly without the pressure of maintaining appearances or managing other people's reactions to my crisis. I told Jennifer I needed to leave and would call her soon. My voice cracked slightly on the last few words, the first sign that my carefully maintained composure was beginning to fracture. Jennifer hugged me tightly despite the expensive formal gowns we were both wearing, clearly not caring about crushing fabric or leaving tear stains on silk. She whispered that she loved me and that Marcus was cruel, and that I deserved so much better than what he had done. Then she let me go, understanding that I needed solitude more than companionship in that moment, that some experiences must be processed alone before they can be shared even with people who care deeply about your well-being. I took the elevator down to the parking garage where my Tesla was waiting. The car felt like a bitter joke in that moment. A gift from Marcus on a previous anniversary that now served as my escape vehicle from the anniversary where he destroyed our marriage. But I had no other immediate transportation available, and was not going to wait for a ride service and risk having a stranger witness whatever emotional breakdown was coming. I sat in the driver's seat staring at the concrete wall for several minutes before I could make myself start the car and begin the drive home. The journey from downtown Seattle to our waterfront estate in Medina passed in a blur of automatic driving, while my conscious mind remained focused on trying to understand what had just happened. I replayed Marcus's words and his expression and the way Alexis had joined him in the spotlight like she belonged there. I thought about the months of planning that must have gone into orchestrating that public announcement. I wondered how many people had known what Marcus was planning and chosen to say nothing to warn me. I questioned every interaction and conversation from the past several years, trying to understand what I had missed, and how I had remained so completely blind to what was actually happening. When I pulled into our driveway and saw the house we had purchased as a symbol of Marcus's success, I felt nothing but emptiness and disconnection. This house had never truly felt like home despite the expensive furnishings and beautiful views. It was a showcase designed to project success, rather than a space built for genuine comfort and authentic living. Walking into the dark, silent house after leaving the Crystal Pavilion felt like entering a museum exhibit about someone else's life, rather than returning to a place that belonged to me in any meaningful sense. I sat at the kitchen island still wearing the emerald silk gown and the borrowed diamonds, unable to summon the energy to change clothes or remove the elaborate hairstyle or wash off the professional makeup. I sat in darkness as time passed without my tracking it, as midnight came and went, as Marcus did not return or call or send any message. The silence was absolute and somehow comforting after the noise and spectacle of the evening. For the first time in hours I could think clearly without the pressure of managing my public presentation, or controlling my visible reactions for the benefit of witnesses. I thought about our entire relationship through the new lens of understanding that Marcus had provided so brutally that evening. I saw patterns I had missed or explained away during our 12 years together. The gradual distancing that accelerated after we got married. The increasing time spent with Alexis and decreasing time spent with me. The systematic exclusion from company decisions despite my title and supposed partnership. The subtle and sometimes explicit messages that my work was less important than his, that my contributions were primarily supportive rather than substantive, that my value was decorative rather than functional. I had been complicit in my own marginalization by accepting Marcus's explanations and internalizing his characterizations of our respective roles and capabilities. I had stopped fighting for equal partnership because fighting seemed exhausting and Marcus always had persuasive arguments for why things needed to be the way he structured them. I had convinced myself that supporting his success was the same as building our shared success since we were married and supposedly had aligned interests. I had sacrificed my own ambitions and identity to accommodate his expanding ego, and his need to be the singular star rather than part of a partnership of equals. But I also recognized in that dark kitchen as Friday morning approached that Marcus had not actually destroyed me despite how completely he had tried. He had humiliated me and betrayed me and ended our marriage in the most public and cruel way imaginable. He had stolen my role in the company I helped create and conducted an affair with the woman he hired to replace me and orchestrated my public destruction, in front of everyone important in Seattle's technology community. But he had not taken away my technical skills or my intelligence or my capacity to build something meaningful. He had not erased years of education and experience. He had not eliminated my ability to make decisions and take action and create value. What Marcus had done, perhaps without intending to, was free me from the comfortable trap our marriage had become. He had made it impossible for me to continue telling myself that supporting his success was enough, that being decorative was acceptable if it came with financial security and social status. He had forced me to either accept his characterization of me as essentially ornamental or prove him wrong by building something significant enough that no one would ever mistake me for decoration again. The choice was stark and clear and would determine everything about my future. By the time dawn began lighting the sky over Lake Washington, turning the water from black to deep blue to pink and gold, I had made the decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I was not going to quietly divorce Marcus and take whatever settlement I could negotiate and disappear into a smaller life where no one remembered I had once been married to someone important. I was not going to accept the narrative he had created about me being decorative furniture that served a purpose for a time but was no longer needed as he evolved and his ambitions expanded. I was going to build something so significant and so undeniable that Marcus Thornton would eventually understand that discarding me was the greatest strategic mistake of his career. I was going to prove that the woman he characterized as decorative was actually capable of creating companies and technologies and value that surpassed anything he had accomplished. I was going to channel every ounce of pain and fury and humiliation into building an empire that would make his success look modest by comparison. I was going to transform the worst moment of my life into the catalyst for becoming someone far more powerful than the woman who had stood frozen in that ballroom, watching her husband destroy her publicly. I had no detailed plan yet. I had no clear vision of exactly what I would build or how I would fund it or who would help me. But I had skills and knowledge and experience, and most importantly, I had determination born from the kind of complete humiliation that either destroys people entirely or transforms them into forces of nature. Marcus thought he had won by replacing me with someone he considered more valuable. He was about to discover that the real competition was just beginning, and that underestimating me would prove to be the most expensive mistake he ever made. The hours between dawn on Friday morning and Monday afternoon, when I would begin taking concrete action, existed in a strange suspended state where time felt both compressed and elongated. I moved through our house like a ghost, inhabiting spaces that no longer belonged to me in any meaningful way. Touching surfaces and objects that represented a life I had been living without truly participating in for years. The silence was absolute and strangely comforting after the spectacle and noise of the gala. Marcus did not return to the house that weekend. He sent no messages and made no calls. His absence was a statement as clear as anything he had said publicly at the Crystal Pavilion. He had moved on completely and expected me to simply accept the new reality he had created without negotiation or discussion. I spent Saturday morning still wearing the emerald silk gown because removing it required energy and decision-making capacity I did not yet possess. I sat at various locations throughout the house watching light move across Lake Washington as morning progressed toward afternoon. My mind was working even though my body remained relatively still. I was processing what had happened and beginning to sort through the wreckage for pieces I might salvage and rebuild into something new. The shock was starting to recede enough that I could think strategically rather than simply experiencing wave after wave of emotional devastation. The most important realization that emerged during those hours of solitary reflection was understanding that my response to Marcus's betrayal would define me far more significantly than the betrayal itself. What had been done to me was terrible and cruel, and designed to inflict maximum damage to my reputation and self-conception. But what I did in response was entirely within my control. I could collapse under the weight of humiliation and accept Marcus's characterization of me as decorative and peripheral. I could seek revenge through destructive means that would ultimately harm me as much as they harmed him. Or I could channel everything I was feeling into building something so substantial that the narrative Marcus tried to create would be revealed as fiction contradicted by undeniable evidence of my actual capabilities. The third option was the only one that felt remotely acceptable. Collapse was simply not available to me regardless of how devastated I felt. My parents had raised me to believe that adversity revealed character rather than creating it, that difficult circumstances were opportunities to demonstrate strength and resilience, rather than excuses for giving up. Destructive revenge might provide temporary satisfaction, but would ultimately diminish me and validate Marcus's implicit claims about my emotional instability. Building something meaningful was the only response that honored who I actually was beneath the layers of accommodation and self-diminishment I had accepted during my marriage. By Saturday afternoon I had finally removed the formal gown and the borrowed jewelry, and washed away the elaborate makeup and hairstyle. I put on comfortable clothes that belonged to me rather than to the carefully constructed image Marcus had wanted me to project. Jeans and a sweater from my graduate school years that I had kept despite Marcus's suggestions that I should update my wardrobe to reflect our current status. Wearing my own clothes rather than the expensive designer items that filled my closet felt like reclaiming a small piece of authentic identity that had been buried under years of performance and accommodation. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island with a notebook and began writing. Not a detailed business plan because I did not yet know enough about what I would build to create comprehensive strategy. But I began documenting what I knew about myself, about my capabilities and knowledge and experience that existed independent of Marcus and his company. I wrote about the technical skills I had developed through years of education and professional work. I listed the projects I had completed as an independent consultant, the problems I had solved for clients who valued my expertise and creativity. I documented the research I had contributed to during graduate school, and the papers I had published demonstrating novel approaches to machine learning challenges. The exercise of cataloging my own capabilities was surprisingly difficult at first. I had spent so many years defining myself primarily in relation to Marcus that identifying what belonged to me alone required conscious effort and deliberate thought. But as I continued writing, patterns emerged that I had not fully recognized or appreciated. I had extensive technical knowledge spanning multiple domains of computer science and software engineering. I had practical experience building systems that solved real problems for actual users. I understood both theoretical foundations and practical implementation, in ways that many successful entrepreneurs did not. I possessed capabilities that were genuinely valuable independent of any connection to Marcus Thornton or his company. The inventory of my own skills and knowledge became the foundation for thinking about what I might build. I did not want to simply replicate what Marcus had created or compete directly in the same market of cloud infrastructure services. That would position me as derivative and reactive, forever compared to his company and judged primarily on whether I could match or exceed what he had accomplished. I wanted to build something that leveraged my particular combination of technical depth and practical experience in ways that created entirely new value, rather than simply competing for existing market opportunities. I spent Saturday evening researching emerging technology trends and identifying problems that were not yet being adequately addressed by existing solutions. I read technical papers and industry reports and startup news looking for gaps where my capabilities might create meaningful advantage. I was searching for the intersection between what I was genuinely good at, what the market genuinely needed, and what I would find intellectually satisfying to work on for the next several years of intensive effort. The intersection of those three dimensions would determine what I built and whether it succeeded or failed. Sunday morning I called Jennifer. She answered immediately despite the early hour and the fact that she was normally protective of her weekend mornings for sleeping in after intense work weeks. Her voice was filled with concern and relief that I was finally reaching out after more than a day of silence following the disaster at the Gala. She asked how I was doing with the kind of careful tone people use when they are worried the person on the other end of the call might be on the verge of complete breakdown. I surprised both of us by answering honestly rather than with the reassuring platitudes I would have offered a week earlier. I told Jennifer I was devastated and humiliated and angrier than I had ever been in my entire life. I told her I had spent the past 36 hours processing what happened and beginning to understand how completely Marcus had manipulated and used me over years of marriage. I told her I was done being the supportive decorative wife who existed primarily to make his life comfortable and his public image complete. And then I told her about the decision I had made in the dark kitchen Friday morning, while watching dawn break over Lake Washington. I was going to build a technology company that would make Marcus Thornton's success look modest by comparison. Jennifer's response revealed why she had been my closest friend for more than a decade. She did not question whether I was capable of what I was proposing or suggest that my ambitions were unrealistic reactions to emotional trauma. She did not encourage me to focus on healing and self-care rather than on building a company in the immediate aftermath of my marriage imploding publicly. Instead, she asked what I needed from her, and how she could help me accomplish what I was setting out to do. Her immediate practical support without skepticism or attempts to moderate my ambitions was exactly what I needed in that moment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.